Log on, tune in, find out. Cambridge Ideas, transforming tomorrow.
In the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone against the threat of invasion by Nazi Germany. France had fallen, and just weeks earlier, a dramatic operation had rescued thousands of British troops from Dunkirk. It was at this moment, on the 18th of June 1940, that Prime Minister Sir Winston Churchill made one of his most dramatic and inspiring speeches of the Second World War. Known as the Finest Hour speech, it was a rallying cry to the people of Britain to prepare themselves for the dark days of battle ahead. According to the original documents, including early drafts, Churchill toiled long and hard over the emotional key phrases of that speech. In this podcast, the military historian Max Arthur meets Allen Packwood, the director of the Churchill Archives Centre at Churchill College, University of Cambridge, to find out more.
Well, here we are, Max, in the strong room of the Churchill Archives Centre. And if we come down here, I'll just open up the mobile shelving. And what we're looking in on now are just some of the papers of Sir Winston Churchill in their boxes.
Good Lord. Vast, isn't it? Absolutely vast.
Now, what I've done is just to get out a small selection, those documents that we're going to talk about today, and I've got them on the table over here.
It was about dawn this morning that the first reports came in saying that German troops were crossing the frontier into Denmark.
But now one bond unites us all, to wage war until victory is won, and never to surrender ourselves to servitude and shame, whatever the cost and the agony may be.
What we're looking at here are the original Typescript notes, the first draft for Churchill's great Finest Hour speech of the 18th of June 1940. And what you're seeing here is the Typescript page, which he would have dictated to the duty secretary and which he has then gone through and annotated. As you can see, the page is covered with his handwritten annotations in red and blue ink.
What I find fascinating is that little phrases that you and I probably would have left, he hasn't. He's turned them into poetry, brought the words to life. I mean, the little bit in the very beginning, the opening sentence, when the French High Command neglected to withdraw the northern armies from Belgium, he's actually deleted neglected and put the word failed.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think what that highlights is how much care and attention Churchill is putting into this speech. He knew how much was riding on this.
Mr. Speaker, the disastrous military events which have happened during the past fortnight have not come to me with any sense of surprise. Indeed, I indicated a fortnight ago, as clearly as I could to the House, that the worst possibilities were open. And I made it perfectly clear that whatever happened in France would make no difference to the resolve of Britain and the British Empire to fight on, if necessary for years, if necessary alone.
What I find interesting is that this was written, composed as really, it's almost like a piece of orchestral music, really, 125 years after the Battle of Waterloo. So as an historian, he would understand the significance of it, but could you give me some idea of the actual background to what was going on in the war, as it were?
This speech, of course, is a response to, effectively, the fall of France. Churchill is very aware that the country and his government are facing a huge national crisis. The Germans have split the Allies, the British Expeditionary Forces had to be evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk, and now France has capitulated, and Britain is facing the prospect of direct attack and even of invasion.
During the last few days, we have successfully brought off the great majority of the troops we had on the lines of communication in France. And 7/8 of the troops we have sent to France since the beginning of the war, that is to say about 350,000 out of 400,000 men, are safely back in this country. Others are still fighting with the French, and fighting with considerable success in their local encounters against the enemy.
And he really did have to know the heart of the matter, because days before this speech, he actually had gone to France, hadn't he?
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. I mean, Churchill worked extremely hard to try and keep Reynaud's government alive and fighting. He travelled to France on the 11th of June, stayed overnight there, met with the French leadership and with the French generals, tried to instill in them his Churchillian fighting spirit. Of course, came away very dispirited, but he doesn't give up. He goes back there again on the 13th of June. So literally, he's only just got back. He turns around, goes back, meets with Reynaud in Tours, but of course, all to no avail.
It's fascinating because there is so much happening day to day. We've had Dunkirk, which we'd never faced in our history before. 300,000 men being lifted from the beaches. Whoever would have thought that would have happened? Mostly arriving back without arms. We're then left alone, really. But it's almost as though he finds being alone quite reassuring.
Thus, the invasion of Great Britain would at this time require the transportation across the sea of hostile armies on a very large scale. And after they had been so transported, they would have to be continually maintained with all the masses of munitions and supplies which are required for continuous battle, and continuous battle it will surely be.
Of course, famously said in his memoirs that when he became Prime Minister, he felt he was walking with destiny. So, I mean, I suppose, he's reached a point at this stage where he now realises that this is a make or break moment. Britain is now standing alone. His destiny is firmly in his hands, or rather, as he would see it, in our hands, in Britain's hands.
And in many ways, in his own words, because this is a colossal speech, isn't it? The way he's evolved it, the way he's thought it through, and realising probably more than any other Prime Minister before him just what impact this would have on the nation.
And consequently, we believe ourselves possessed of the capacity to continue the war in the air under better conditions than we have ever experienced before. I look forward confidently to the exploits of our fighter pilots, these splendid men, this brilliant youth, who will have the glory of saving their native land, their island home, and all they love from the most deadly of all attacks.
And what we have over here is something else that gives you a little bit more background about the Finest Hour speech. What we're looking at, Max, is the original diary kept by Jock Colville, Sir John Colville, who was one of Winston Churchill's private secretaries, and so, of course, was very much at the centre of these affairs. I've opened it up on the 18th of June 1940. Colville, as one of Churchill's private secretaries, took a very keen interest in this speech. I mean, he would have seen Churchill developing it, and he actually went along to hear the Prime Minister deliver it in the House of Commons. So you have this wonderful entry here where he says, went to the House and heard the PM speak on the collapse of France. And what's interesting is that, to Colville's mind, he spoke less well than on the last occasion and referred more often to his notes. But of course, Colville points out that he ended magnificently, which of course he did. Colville actually heard that speech not once but twice that day. So he goes to the Commons to hear it, but then when he's at dinner that evening, he listens to it on the radio, and again records his impressions in the diary. He says at 9 o'clock, the PM spoke on the wireless, and Colville points out that it was almost word for word what he'd said in the House, but that it was too long and he sounded tired. Well, fortunately, most of the nation didn't agree with that analysis, and only someone that close to Churchill, I think, would have been so critical, hypercritical about that speech.
There are a good many people who say, never mind, win or lose, sink or swim, better die than submit to tyranny, and such a tyranny. And I do not dissociate myself from them. But I can assure them that our professional advisers of the three services unitedly advise that we should carry on the war, and that there are good and reasonable hopes of final victory.
Even here, on the final speaking notes, you still have last-minute changes and annotations, clearly indicating that Churchill was working and reworking this speech right up to the point of delivery. You can perhaps imagine him sitting on the front bench of the House of Commons just before standing up, spotting an error and making a quick change. And perhaps the best example of this comes on the penultimate page of these final speaking notes, where Churchill has spoken about Europe being overrun. He's about to go on to say what General Weygand calls the Battle of France is over, the Battle of Britain is about to begin. And just before that phrase, he's added, in his own red pen, at the last moment, all shall be restored.
If we are now called upon to endure what they have been suffering, we shall emulate their courage. And if final victory rewards our toils, they shall share the gains. Aye, and freedom shall be restored to all. We abate nothing of our just demands. Not one jot or tittle do we recede. Czechs, Poles, Norwegians, Dutch, Belgians have joined their causes to our own. All these shall be restored.
As you move from first draft to finished speaking notes, the speech undergoes a transformation. It's set out at sort of A5 size, presumably so that it would fit comfortably in Churchill's hand or in his pocket. But more than that, it's also set out in a blank verse format, which is often called speech form, and which others referred to as psalm form or hymn form, because of course it's set out like the Book of Psalms. And when you see the speech laid out in this way on the page, looking like poetry, it brings it to life. It gives him, I think, the rhythm, it gives him the emphasis, it enables that great Churchill oratory that we all remember. And of course, nowhere is that more evident in this speech than in the very final page, this sort of great crescendo.
Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science.
Now, Alan, we've got this remarkable letter, the most intimate of letters, from Clementine to her husband.
Well, let me just spread this out for you, because what we have here is the most amazing letter from Clementine Churchill, the wife of Winston Churchill, of course, written to her husband on the 27th of June 1940, so just 2 weeks after the finest hour speech, but perhaps giving an insight into some of the terrible pressures and strains he was under at that time. She writes, "My darling, I hope you will forgive me if I tell you something that I feel you ought to know. One of the men in your entourage, a devoted friend, has been to me and told me that there is a danger of your being generally disliked by your colleagues and subordinates because of your rough, sarcastic and overbearing manner. It seems your private secretaries have agreed to behave like schoolboys and take what's coming to them and then escape out of your presence, shrugging their shoulders." And she goes on, and very personal passage here where she says, "My darling Winston, I must confess that I have noticed a deterioration in your manner, and you're not so kind as you used to be. It is for you to give the orders, and if they're bungled, except for the King, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Speaker, you can sack anyone and everyone. Therefore, with this terrific power, you must combine urbanity, kindness, and if possible, Olympic calm." And she ends it here by saying, "You won't get the best results by irascibility and rudeness. They will breed either dislike or a slave mentality, rebellion in war being out of the question." I think there is a big danger in this day and age of Churchill assuming a purely iconic status. And I think the archive reveals all the aspects of his character. You can see him wrestling with problems. You can see him struggling sometimes with his irascibility. You can see him not necessarily coming to the final conclusion straight away, and you can see how he reached that conclusion. What you can see here is his self-belief, it's his determination, it's his humanity that leads us on from the dark days of 1940 to final victory in 1945.
A very great crowd is collected already. Thousands upon thousands of people gathered to share this historic day with the King and Queen. Here they come. First Her Majesty the Queen, it comes into view, then the King in the uniform of an Admiral of the Fleet, the two princesses standing on the balcony. Listen to the crowd.
What we're talking about is the raw material of history, the evidence of history. Yes, it's true that you can make all of these papers available digitally now, and obviously that's something that we will be working towards. But how do you know that what you see on your computer screen is actually what Churchill wrote? And the only way you can be sure of that is by preserving the original and having the original to go back to check. And it's vitally important, I think, that that evidence is available for future generations so that they don't have to rely on hindsight, they don't have to rely on interpretations of historians. If they wish to, they can go back and check the evidence themselves. The other reason I would give, of course, is that it brings history alive. There's nothing quite like seeing the piece of paper that Churchill signed, that Stalin signed, or having in front of you, as we've had today, the page that Churchill had in his hand when he delivered that amazing climax to his finest hour speech.
Let us, therefore, brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
That was Allen Packwood, the director of the Churchill Archives Centre at Churchill College, Cambridge, talking to the military historian Max Arthur. You've been listening to a podcast from the University of Cambridge.
Cambridge Ideas. Transforming tomorrow.